Hello, my name is Matt Hayes and I'm a research assistant in the Insect Ecology Research Group at the Zoology Department in Cambridge, and over the last few years I've also been working at the University Museum of Zoology. What I want to do today is take you on a bit of a behind-the-scenes tour of the Zoology Museum and also talk to you about the importance of the collections that we have stored there and the various different ways that we can use them. So firstly, let's have a little look at the Zoology Museum itself. Well, the museum actually only reopened in June 2018 after a 5-year redevelopment. So that was 5 years of being shut to the public, and that's a long time not having anyone come and see a public-facing museum. But what it does mean, now that we've reopened, is that when we're not on lockdown, we have beautiful new displays for people to come and see, displaying specimens from all across the animal kingdom. So you can see on the picture to the side of me that we have some very prominent specimens such as skeletons of African and Asian elephants, and in the far right you should be able to see also an extinct giant ground sloth kind of rearing up in the background there, so a species you can sadly no longer see in the wild today. The single largest specimen that we have on display at the museum is of a male fin whale skeleton. Now, this is truly colossal. It's 21 metres long and hangs up in the entrance hall, but we also have a lot of smaller specimens on display as well. As I mentioned, we're a zoology museum that wants to celebrate the true diversity of the animal kingdom. So we've got reptiles, amphibians, birds, fish, and the much smaller, but I would say probably even more important group, the invertebrates as well. So we've got lots of insects on display too, and that's things like these large copper butterflies. These are the things that actually do run the planet, so we've made sure we've given enough of our displays over to celebrate their diversity as well. In total, we estimate that we have between 6,000 to 7,000 specimens on display in the public galleries. But something that I think most people don't fully appreciate about museums is just how much material they store behind the scenes which isn't on view to the public. Because we estimate that we have more in the order of 2 million specimens on site. So that's less than 1% of the material in the museum is actually in the public galleries. And those kind of pieces of material are actually stored behind the scenes in storerooms like this. So this is the insect store, which is the largest single storeroom. And as you can see, it's full of these cabinets, and each of these cabinets is full of drawers, and each of those drawers is full of rows and columns of insects, like the large blue butterfly here. We think we've probably got around 1 million insects alone behind the scenes. They're stored here for a variety of different reasons. So a lot of them are used for research, which I'll get onto later, and a lot of them require conservation or preservation. Remember, some of these are a few hundred years old. They might need a little bit of love and care every now and then, or to be repaired. And also physically, we just don't have enough room in the museum galleries to display all of this material. So we try and trade things out every now and then. So we take something from the storerooms and put it on display, and take something back from the display and put it in the storerooms to be repaired or protected, so that you can see as much of this material as possible. So yeah, 2 million specimens. It's a very large number. And how did we come to have so many specimens in the museum collection? The museum actually opened in 1865, and this is a picture that shows you what it would have looked like way back before the refurbishment, near when it first opened. And when the museum did first get established, a lot of local smaller museums donated specimens from their collections, but also famous naturalists of the day, including Charles Darwin and people such as that, have contributed to it since then. And actually this is something that continues to this day, so we are still getting new material given to the museum and the collection keeps growing. Sometimes if someone's maybe approaching the end of their life and they have a large private collection, they might approach a museum to see if they can look after it after they're gone and preserve it professionally. But also if you're doing research in the field and you're collecting specimens, you want to bring them back to where you live, say, or bring them back to an institution where other people can come and research them after you have researched them yourself, then you might give that to a museum. So we're still building the collection. What I want to do now though is talk to you about one specific collector who was very important to when the museum first opened, but continues to be important to this day. A lot of the work that he did, a lot of the recordings he made 200 years ago are still very relevant for wildlife conservation and research going on now. The naturalist and collector I want to talk to you about is this chap here. This is Leonard Jenyns. Now don't worry if you haven't heard of him, I hadn't heard of him either before starting to study him. But he really is a fascinating character on the fringes of some of the most important discoveries in natural history of the last 200 years. So he's a good person to know about. And this is a picture of him here. He looks quite stern in this photograph. I think that's more a reflection of how photos were taken back in the day, because accounts of him suggest he was actually quite a nice person. And he was born in 1800 and lived in Posham Hall, just north of Cambridgeshire. His father was a vicar, and he preached in Swaffham Prior, which is another little village just next to Bottisham. So Leonard Jenyns had quite a religious upbringing, but it was also one which had an interest in wildlife and the natural world fostered from a very early age. He was quite lucky that his godfather and great uncle had an extensive natural history library and would lend Leonard Jenyns these books on wildlife. So he had this interest in the natural world from an early age, which he carried through education and through to his time in Cambridge, where he went in 1818. And it's at Cambridge that he met other notable naturalists of the day, including one I've already mentioned, who is rather more famous, Charles Darwin. Darwin was about 10 years younger than Jenyns, so he didn't join Cambridge until about a decade later. But when he did, he actually was a rather reluctant student. He had a father who was very concerned that he wouldn't really amount to much. So Darwin's father kept sending him to different places to try and train for professions he wasn't really very interested in. So first of all, Charles Darwin went to Edinburgh to train to be a medical doctor, but he really wasn't that interested in medicine. He preferred to spend his time going to museums or going on little excursions into the wild. And he flunked out of medicine after 2 years. And then Darwin's father thought, okay, what's another respectable profession that I can get my son to study for? I know, I'll send him off to train for the clergy, so similar to Jenyns. So Darwin arrived in Cambridge to study for the clergy, but once again, he was a reluctant student. He wasn't really that interested in his studies. He was far more interested in going out into the countryside and searching for beetles. He was actually very well known for this. This is a little caricature that one of Darwin's friends did for him. And I think one of the original taglines for this is something like "Darwin riding his hobby." So as you can see, it's Darwin with a massive beetle net riding a giant beetle. So he was clearly quite well known for the hobby that he had, and he spent all his time doing. And we actually have something very special on display in the museum. So when it's not in lockdown and you can go and see it again, we have Darwin's original beetle collection from his time in Cambridge. These specimens would have been collected by Darwin himself, or perhaps by his friends and contemporaries, and they would have traded them, almost like trading cards. So say Darwin had 5 greater diving beetles but wanted a different species, he can maybe trade them and get a complete set, as it were. But a really cool thing to have. So you would think that having this shared love of the natural world and wildlife, Jenyns and Darwin might have been firm friends when they met each other at Cambridge. And that does sort of become true, but firstly, they actually don't like each other very much. They're also sort of rivals. They both had a mentor, quite a famous guy called John Stevens Henslow, who was a professor at Cambridge, and it seems that maybe they were both vying for his attention, or at least they were competing in some way. So there's a really funny letter we have, an early letter from Darwin, which I think casts him in a slightly different light to what we're used to. So this is what it says. It's an early letter from Darwin to his cousin. It says, "You will see my name in Stephen's latest number, and I am glad of it, if it is merely to spite Mr. Jenyns." So what he's saying is here, that he's got his work published, or his name published in Stephen's work, and he's proud of that, but the thing he's most proud of is rubbing it in Jenyns' face because Jenyns didn't get published. I think it's just quite funny that this is a side of Darwin which maybe we don't get to see that much. But that being said, they did a complete 180, and later they did become firm friends. So this is Darwin describing Jenyns years later. He says, "At first I disliked him from his somewhat grim and sarcastic expression, and it is not often that a first impression is lost, but I was completely mistaken and found him very kind-hearted, pleasant, and with a good stock of humour." Okay, so they went from rivals not really liking each other to now they are friends. And this is good because then they were both in Cambridge at the same time, and they could both go on excursions together, go to lectures on wildlife, on natural history, but also, of course, Darwin's great passion was collecting beetles, so they could go out collecting beetles together. And this is a picture of a beetle specimen from the Zoology Museum, which was actually collected by Darwin. You can see the label here. Darwin wasn't always the best at recording things on his labels, but this one just says near Cambridge, so could kind of be anywhere, but it's near Cambridge. C. Darwin, so Charles Darwin collected that, and you can see below the other label says X. Col. L. Jenyns, so X collection Leonard Jenyns. So it was at one point collected by Darwin and then found its way into Jenyns' collection. The two of them were clearly collecting together, or at least exchanging beetles at some point after. And one of my favourite stories about Darwin actually comes from a letter that he sent to Jenyns about one such beetle collecting expedition. So basically, Darwin was out collecting, he had been out collecting beetles for a few hours or so, and he had already collected two, and he had one in each hand. And it's at this point that he saw a beetle called a crucifix ground beetle, which it's quite rare today. It was quite rare back then as well. And being Charles Darwin and loving beetles so much, he couldn't bring himself to drop either of the beetles that he had in his hands. So he thought, okay, what can I do to make sure I actually get this crucifix ground beetle? So he put one of the beetles that he had in his hand in his mouth to free it up to grab the crucifix ground beetle. The problem is the beetle he put in his mouth then released a kind of hot defensive spray down his throat, which caused him to spit it out and for him to lose all three beetles. And what we think happened is that he actually put a bombardier beetle in his mouth. And this is a defensive mechanism they have for dissuading predators. And you can see that it worked, because the beetle that Darwin was going for got away, and so did the other two that he had in his hands, or in his mouth. And again, there's another story I really like about Darwin, because at this point in his life, he was just a student kind of ignoring his studies, going out and putting beetles in his mouth. And now we know him for the amazing theories he came up with in terms of natural selection. So what I'm saying is really there's hope for everyone. And it's now that we get to the more famous part of this story. So if we fast forward a few years to 1831, Darwin's now been at Cambridge for about 3 years, and Captain Robert Fitzroy then comes in search of a naturalist to join him on a 5-year voyage of discovery around the world on HMS Beagle. Because Jenyns and their mentor Henslow, who I mentioned before, were both senior to Darwin, they were actually offered this job first, but both of them had to turn down the offer. So Henslow had a young family, and Jenyns was actually by this point a reverend, so he had people in the church that relied on him, and his wife was sadly actually quite ill at the time, so they couldn't really leave for 5 years. But instead they suggested Darwin as their replacement. And this is the voyage that Darwin went on leading to the Galapagos Islands, and where he began to formulate his ideas on evolution via natural selection, which is one of the most important developments in natural sciences of the last 200 years. So if you think about either Jenyns or Henslow taking this opportunity, if they'd done that, then this important bit of history might have taken a very different route. And it's also cool to highlight that Jenyns was on the fringes of one of the most important discoveries of the last 200 years as well. That being said, Jenyns was, well, I think he was very nice in how he described the decision to turn down the option of going on the Beagle voyage. So he, when he was asked about this in later life, he said this. He said he regretted his unimaginative decision to not go on the Beagle voyage, but that no better man than Darwin could have been chosen. So he's basically saying that if he had gone on the Beagle voyage, he might not have made any of the discoveries that, or come up with any of the theories that Darwin did, which I think is quite a modest thing to say, really. That was the famous part of the story, but Jenyns didn't go on the Beagle voyage, so what did he do instead? Well, he actually stayed in Cambridgeshire for around 30 years. In fact, after being offered this opportunity to go on a 5-year voyage of discovery around the world and turning it down, Jenyns never once left the UK throughout his life. He was very content. He was, at this point, a reverend. He had quite a lot of time on his hands to wander through the countryside and make recordings of the various bits of wildlife that he saw around him. So he did this for around 30 years. And during his time, he and his mentor Henslow also started a museum for the Cambridge Philosophical Society. So the Cambridge Philosophical Society was an institution co-founded by Henslow, where naturalists and scientists of the day could get together and talk about the various topics that were in the news at that time, and to discuss their own research with one another. And in 1865, this Cambridge Philosophical Society museum collection was actually donated to the University Museum of Zoology in Cambridge, where I now work. So Jenyns and the collections and recordings that he made are incredibly important to the museum that we have today, because they helped form part of the nucleus of what was first stored here. And Jenyns specimens are still stored in the museum till this day. I'm obviously more interested in the insects, but we also have a huge number of vertebrate specimens from him as well. This is a drawer of Hymenoptera collected by Jenyns, so lots of his bees and wasps, and each of these has its own data label, which should tell us where and when they were collected. And this is really getting back to the idea of why it's so important for us to have these historical museum collections. You can't go out and collect historical specimens today, because obviously they're not there anymore. So if you didn't have museums which stored them, then this historical information would be lost. And this information on where and when species used to exist gives us a record of change over time. You can compare this with where species are today, or how their ranges have shifted, or potentially how some species have gone extinct over time, and you can begin to build up a picture that goes back in time of how things have changed in the natural world. And perhaps even more important than the actual specimens themselves are the notebooks and the notes that Jenyns recorded down. This is one of Jenyns' notebooks, and I mentioned before that he actually lived in Cambridgeshire for around 30 years, so he could build up his notes over 3 decades. And this is quite rare for a museum collector. Most collectors only really focused on collecting specimens from a few select species they were really passionate about. And also a lot of them gathered specimens from areas they happened to go on holiday or trips they made. It's quite rare to have a really long time frame of collections and specimens from one location such as Cambridgeshire. And what's brilliant about Jenyns is that he actually took it upon himself to write down an entry for every single species that he and his contemporaries found in Cambridgeshire over that 30-year period. He will obviously have missed some things, it's impossible to get things perfect, but this means we have a near comprehensive record of what lived in Cambridgeshire 200 years ago that we can compare with what lives here today. And that is a really, really valuable resource to have, and I'll give you an example of how we can use this. So here we have a swallowtail butterfly at the top and a large copper butterfly at the bottom, and we can compare the notes that Jenyns writes with those notes that we have recorded more recently, or the information we know of from today. So what does Jenyns say about the swallowtail butterfly? He says, in around 1820 to 1849, which is when he was making his notes, he says, found in the greatest plenty throughout the fens between Ely and Cambridge. And for the large copper butterfly, he says, not uncommon in Cambridgeshire. Well, that's really quite striking, because we now know that today the swallowtail butterfly is extinct locally in the county. You have to go to Norfolk to go and find it. And the large copper butterfly is actually extinct in the country. So clearly, comparing these historical notes from Jenyns with the recordings we have today, we can see that a huge change has taken place. What's even more powerful than that is once you know what has changed, you can begin to think why and begin to understand the reasons for these declines. And with these two species, these are actually wetland specialists. So what it seems to indicate is that basically a loss in wetland habitat is what has caused these species to disappear. So this is a map, the blue area showing the former extent of wetlands in southeast England. It's thought that 99% of this habitat has been lost because it's been drained to replace with agricultural land. And if this habitat has been lost, which these wetland specialists rely on, it's understandable that maybe they would follow suit and also decline. Okay, so we can tell that things have changed, we can tell why, but even more impressive than that is that you can then actually begin to hopefully bring some of these species back to do modern day conservation, which is supported by the findings from Jenyns 200 years ago. The little red area on this map is the Great Fen Project, which is being run by the Wildlife Trust for Bedfordshire, Cambridgeshire and Northamptonshire, and it's re-wetting a quite substantial area of landscape. I know it looks small compared to the previous 100% of the fenland that was there, but this is still 3,700 hectares, so it's a huge site. And the hope is that if we re-wet this landscape, bring this habitat back, that some of these wetland specialists will also be able to return. So this is just one example of how museum specimens tracking change into the past and showing us what used to exist here are a powerful way for us to research things which otherwise we wouldn't be able to do. And I think a really key point to drive home is that museum specimens offer us opportunity. Naturalists 200 years ago, when they were collecting these specimens like Jenyns, probably weren't thinking about all of the amazing ways that people in the future would use these specimens for research. For example, Jenyns would never be thinking that we'd be doing genetic analysis on these museum specimens, but this is something that is now possible. We can have a look at modern day populations of a species and historical museum specimens, compare their genetics and look for any signs of things like past bottlenecks. And the only reason we can do that is because people like Jenyns spent the time, put in the effort, and actually collected these species 200 years ago. So hopefully that has given you a little bit of an insight into the Zoology Museum and all the specimens that we have stored here, in particular the collections of this man, Leonard Jenyns, and why he is so important to the museum, both in terms of when it was founded, but also in terms of the work that continues to go on to this day.